Writing a series of books is often a bad idea, especially for new authors, and I can prove it with math. This is Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. And yes, there will be a bit of math in this episode, but please stick with me. For readers to buy book number 2 in a series, they have to first purchase, read, finish, and enjoy book number 1. If they don't do those 4 things, they won't be interested in book number 2. Now, depending on whose numbers you use, the average book sells between 100 and 250 copies in its lifetime. Now, that average is pulled down by a lot of books that sell basically no copies. So let's take an above average book number 1 that sells 1,000 copies. Now, let's generously assume that 80% of the readers who bought the book started reading it. That brings us down to 800 readers. And before you judge, just ask yourself, how many books have you purchased that you haven't started yet? Some readers already own several lifetimes worth of future reading, and they're still buying books. We love those readers. They help keep the industry afloat, but they don't tend to finish the books they buy. Now let's assume that of the 800 readers who started reading your book, 80% of them went on to finish your book. I know this is generous. Most books don't have an 80% completion rate, but remember, this is an example from an above average book. So 80% of 800 is 640. Now, let's assume that of the 640 people who finished the book, 80% of them enjoyed it enough to want to buy the sequel. That brings us down to 512 readers. The total addressable market for a sequel to a book that sold 1,000 copies is 512 readers. If you had their email addresses, you could sell 500 copies of your book with just a handful of emails. But once you sold 512 copies, sales will crater until you can get more readers to buy, read, finish, and enjoy that first book. Now, let's compare that total addressable market to the total addressable market for a standalone book. Let's say you write in a genre where there's 75,000 readers who buy a book in your genre every month. And let's say there's another 300,000 readers who buy a book in your genre every year. This means in any given month, there's around 100,000 readers looking to buy a book in your genre. That's a sizable market. You can market a standalone book to all 100,000 readers, and they're all potential customers. But that sequel, the potential market is only 512 people. If you don't have their emails, there may be no way to let them know about book number 2, and so you may not even get all 512 sales. Those numbers are bleak. So why do so many authors recommend writing books in series? Well, let's go through their reasoning and go through their math and see if writing a series could make sense for you. The primary advantage to writing books in a series is that if book number 1 is a hit, the cost to acquire readers for the subsequent books is very low. So to explain the jargon here, cost of customer acquisition or cost of reader acquisition is the marketing cost to acquire a new reader. So if you spent $500 to sell 100 copies of your book, your cost of reader acquisition is $5 per reader. And this can be helpful in terms of calculating profitability to keep it on a per book basis. And so let's say it does cost you $5 in advertising to acquire a reader for book number 1. And let's say you've got that ebook priced at $4.99. With these numbers, you're making $3.49 per reader. So if you spend $5 in marketing to acquire a reader worth $3.49, you're losing $1.51 per reader. To fix this, you could raise your price or write books in a series. If 50% of book number 1 readers go on to read book number 2, that means that you make $3.49 on the first book and half that on the second book. Technically, you're making $3.49 on the second book, but you have half as many readers. But to keep the math simple, let's say you're only making half that in terms of a per book basis. So we'll add the $3.49 to $1.74, and that brings us to a lifetime value of a reader of $5.24. So with a 2-book series, advertising now nets you a profit of 24 cents per reader. And each subsequent book makes the series even more profitable. So that's the math behind the pro series argument. But it all has one weakness, one fatal flaw, one critical assumption. It all depends on book number 1 being a hit. Most authors can't acquire readers for $5 a reader. Traditionally published authors get paid so little, they can't afford to advertise at all. It's just off the table if you're trad. And many indie authors have a book that lacks sufficient appeal to make the ads work. In publishing, all the easy paths lead to poverty, and the shortcuts all lead to despair. Advertising is not a panacea. And some books can acquire readers, but they have a completion rate of just 25%. In fact, this is very common, particularly for authors new in their career who don't know how to manage tension yet. They often don't have readers finishing their books. They struggle to get reviews because people aren't finishing their books. And if only 1 out of 4 people who buy your book finish it, that sequel is doomed because now you just can't get enough people to buy number 1 to ever sell enough copies of book number 2. Before you can thrive in advertising, you must first write a book that readers want to buy, that they want to read, that they want to finish, and they want more of when they're done. There are no shortcuts to making a book that appealing. As the old adage goes, good advertising helps a bad product fail faster. Or, put another way, advertising only works with appealing books. And if book number 1 is not appealing, adding sequels only makes the problem worse because now you have to pull readers through an unappealing book number 1 before they can get to the potentially more appealing book number 2. Beware the rookie year. When you start your career by writing book number 1 in a series, the nature of the series sends all new readers through that freshman effort for the rest of your career, or at least for the rest of the life of that series. Before readers can enjoy your newer, better, more polished writing, they must first suffer through your oldest, sloppiest writing. When readers tell their friends, author Smith, his books really get good around book 3 in the series, author Smith is in trouble. Marketing a series with a weak first book is like trying to run with weights on your ankles. Larry Correia says that publishing is the only industry where you are forever judged by the performance of your rookie year. And for authors who write in a series, this is often a sad reality, but it's not true for everyone. Authors who write standalone books can make the rookie year disappear. And to prove it, let me ask you a question. What is the title of C.S. Lewis's first novel? And sound off in the comments if you know this from memory. No, it's not Screwtape Letters. No, it's not The Great Divorce. What was his first novel? His first novel was Pilgrim's Regress, which is perhaps his worst-selling novel. Most C.S. Lewis fans have not purchased, read, finished, and loved Pilgrim's Regress. Forcing readers to read Pilgrim's Regress before reading his other books would have been a marketing disaster. Thank God he didn't put it in a series. C.S. Lewis's world-changing impact on culture, religion, and fiction may have never happened if he had followed the current advice about putting every book in a series. Pilgrim's Regress didn't change the world. Narnia did, and it took him time to write Narnia. Now, a handful of you are in the YouTube comments right now talking about how Pilgrim's Regress is a masterpiece, and who am I to question the great C.S. Lewis? And sure, Pilgrim's Regress is a profound book. But to change the world, a novel needs to be both profound and fun to read. For a scholar like C.S. Lewis, the profound part came easy. Writing something that was fun to read, that took some practice. Eventually, he figured it out, and Narnia is both profound and fun to read. And if it took C.S. Lewis a few books and 17 years to figure it out, don't expect to get it right on your very first book. C.S. Lewis also had a major advantage that you don't have. He had J.R.R. Tolkien reading his early drafts and giving him notes, and it still took him years to figure it out. Imagine if Brandon Sanderson had made Elantris book number 1 in the Cell Archive series. His career may have stalled out right there. Elantris wasn't a bad book. or Elantris, or however you pronounce it. But it never sold enough copies to justify a true sequel. And when he did write another book that took place on Cell, he made that a standalone book as well. In Sanderson's recommended Cosmere reading, Elantris is the second to last book on the list. To give you an idea, he recommends readers read almost 3 million words worth of Brandon Sanderson books before he recommends that they read Elantris. Elantris is for superfans, so it's a good thing he didn't make it book number 1 in his series. Still not convinced? Let's look at the king of writing book series, a fellow you may have heard of, a fellow by the name of James Patterson. Do you know what his first book was? The Thomas Berryman Number, a standalone novel. And if you look up that book on Amazon, it has only 3 stars. It's really hard to get 3 stars on Amazon, especially with a book with over 1,000 reviews. But James Patterson's many fans find his first book to be boring. They certainly wouldn't buy, read, finish, or enjoy it enough to justify a series. It took time for Patterson to find his voice and find his audience. If every Patterson fan had to read the Thomas Berryman Number before reading his other books, Patterson would not be the household name he is today. Patterson started writing standalone books in 1977. He didn't write the first Alex Cross novel until 1993. That's 16 years of standalone books before starting his signature series. Nowadays, everything Patterson writes is a series, but he had to earn that through the hard work and reputation building of writing really good standalone books. Don't expect to find a shortcut past those early years of hard work. Patterson had to put in the work, Lewis had to put in the work, and Sanderson had to put in the work. Thankfully, these authors didn't follow the popular advice of putting books in series. And by doing so, they saved themselves from rookie efforts that would have both defined and doomed their careers. When taking advice, it's important to be aware of survivorship bias. If you have 1,000 people in a room and they all flip a coin, and everyone who flips tails sits down, after a while you'll end up with one person still standing who flipped heads a dozen times. But don't ask that person for coin flipping advice. When you see an author whose first book is a breakaway success, what you don't see is the 999 authors who tried and failed to find a significant readership for their first book. You also don't see the trunk books that the author wrote and didn't publish. Every year, millions of people ruin themselves financially gambling. But every year, some people do win the lottery. When a lottery winner who went into debt to buy lottery tickets tells you to follow his example and go into debt to buy lottery tickets, don't listen to him. His luck is not transferable. Beware of fellow authors peddling that same kind of advice. Yeah, man, if your book's not selling, write a few more sequels. Then spend thousands of dollars on Facebook ads. It totally worked for me, man. Don't judge a guru based on his own success. He might just be that lucky person who flipped heads 12 times in a row. Judge mentors by the success of their students. Listening to sages whose disciples also find success will save you from a lot of bad advice. Speaking of advice, the best advice for the author whose book just sold 1 million copies is to write a sequel. Even if we use the numbers we used before, that's 500,000 additional sales for book 2 that all you have to do is send an email to get. And likely it's another 500,000 sales for book 3. But the reality is, if the book was a hit, it likely has a much higher read-through rate than the typical book. And plus, hits generate more attention as social proof kicks in. And for more on social proof, I have a whole episode on that topic. But just realize that success breeds success. So writing a series is good advice for authors who've written a popular book. But what about those other 999 authors whose books sold hundreds of copies instead of thousands of copies? Should they write a sequel? Not if they want to write for a living. They'll find more success and more money writing another standalone book. Figure out why the first book was not appealing and work to make your next book more appealing to readers. Sequels tend to be pretty similar to their predecessors, and if readers didn't go crazy for book number 1, they won't buy book number 2. This fixation on series has created a problem for the publishing industry called battered reader syndrome. Two of the most popular fantasy authors, George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss, never finished their series. And it's hard to blame them, right? They're both postmodern in philosophy, and postmodernism, when followed to its logical conclusion, tends to end in black-pilled nihilism. And admitting that everything is meaningless is not a satisfying way to conclude a story. So it's easier for them to avoid writing a conclusion. It saves them from facing the emptiness of their worldview, and it saves them from having readers emailing them that they don't like the ending. But by refusing to finish their stories, they do annoy readers and hurt their fellow authors. Fantasy readers are twice burned and have become timid to try new series, especially series from new authors who've never completed a series or standalone book before. But the problem isn't just Rothfuss and Martin, and it's not just in fantasy. Every genre is littered with incomplete book series and authors who will never complete them. Most authors follow that write a series advice, and many of them give up on writing before they complete their series. This also hurts them in terms of their legacy, because they could give their heirs a completed standalone book, but they don't want to give their heirs the first 2 books of a 12-book series that they never finished. That doesn't make you look good to posterity. So, for Battered readers, seeing that a book is book number 1 of the Booklarian Chronicles, it's a liability instead of an asset for those Battered readers. It tells the readers that this story may not have a satisfying ending, and perhaps no ending at all. Readers who don't know you won't trust you to complete all 3 books in your trilogy, and they may wait to buy book number 1 until you've already published book number 3. This makes it really hard for new authors to attract readers to new series. Fortunately, there's an easy way to build trust with Battered readers, and that is to write a standalone book with sequel potential. Make book number 1 totally standalone. Keep the numbering off the cover. Don't mention the series name anywhere on the sales page. Just write a good story with a good ending. This is actually what C.S. Lewis did with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you look at the first edition of that book, there is no number. There's no mention of the Chronicles of Narnia, and there's no promise of future books. And this is key, the ending of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is satisfying. He doesn't leave the reader on some unsatisfying cliffhanger, and he doesn't leave any dangling plot threads. Now, the copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on your bookshelf, which is a much later printing, I imagine, it does have a series name on it, and it does have a book number, because this can all be added later. And depending on where you bought the book, it might not even be book number 1. Speaking of which, I think we need to hold an ecumenical council to proclaim all Narnia box sets with The Magician's Nephew as book number 1 as apostate box sets. The published order is the best order to read the Narnia books. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is and should always be book number 1. And if you disagree, make your case in the YouTube comments, and the Council of Nerds will decide your fate. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, Battered readers. In this age of Battered readers, it's a lot easier to turn a successful standalone book into a popular series than it is to use a series to make the first book successful. If you're unpublished or only have a handful of books on Amazon, write a standalone book. Make it the best book you can possibly write. Open strong and stick the landing. Prove to yourself and to your readers that you can write a satisfying ending. Keep enough characters alive to go on another adventure, but don't promise to write a sequel. Only write that adventure if there's demand for it, market demand. If your standalone book sells like crazy, write a sequel. If it doesn't take off, take everything you learned writing that first book and make an even better standalone book. Again, rinse and repeat until you figured out what resonates with readers. Then, once you've written your hit, you've earned the opportunity to write your sequels. Here's the mathematical way to say this. If you can acquire readers to a standalone book for $5 a reader or less, write a sequel. You can make it work. If it costs you $5 a reader or more, start over with a new standalone book instead. This approach reduces your risk while giving you access to the upside of having a series. It's like switching from buying lottery tickets, which are all or nothing, to investing in appreciable assets. You can have the opportunity to write a series without having to commit to writing sequels to an unpopular book for the next 5 years of your life. Now, my advice for successful authors is different. If you already have a tribe of readers, if you've already figured out how to write books they love, and you want to commit your next several books to be in a series, go for it. You've earned the trust of your readers to write a series, and it's very fun, both for you and for them, for the story to unfold across many volumes. But don't tell brand new authors with no platform to follow your example. It hurts them by committing them to books that may or may not find an audience, and it hurts you by contributing to battered reader syndrome, which scares readers away from books altogether. New authors don't have the trust you have. They don't have the skills you have. And by encouraging them to write a series, you may be dooming their careers without realizing it. When I was in Little League, I really wanted to steal bases, and our third base coach would never let me steal the bases. He let his son steal the bases, but he would never give me the signal to steal. And I thought this was very unfair. So, in one game, I stole a base. I did it anyway. Or at least, I tried to steal a base. I was tagged out. It turned out the third base coach knew something that I didn't. He knew that his son was faster than I was. And to make matters worse, I probably would have made it to home plate if I had taken the bases one at a time. But by trying to go fast, by thinking I was faster than I was, I ended up on the bench with a very angry coach yelling at me for not following directions. So, practice your running and get fast before trying to steal bases. And in that same way, practice your writing and write an appealing standalone book before trying your hand at a series. Be faithful in the little things. And until you're faithful with that which is in others, who will give you that which is your own? Special thanks to our brand new January patrons. We had a lot of new patrons last month. Thank you so much for your support that helps keep this podcast on the air. I really appreciate it. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com. You can find the blog version of this episode at authormedia.com/448. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.